He refused every woman, until the Apache woman asked, "Are you looking for a wife or salvation?" The man lived alone at the edge of the Arizona desert, in a small, weathered cabin that looked like it had grown from the sand itself. He was known by everyone in the nearby town, though few had ever entered his home. People whispered about him in the marketplace or at the saloon, saying he was proud, stubborn, and impossible to marry. He refused every woman who approached him, and yet he was not a cruel man. There was a calmness to him, a quiet strength that both intimidated and fascinated others. Some said it was the look in his eyes, steady and unyielding, as if he carried a weight no one else could see. Every morning he would rise before dawn, lighting a small fire in the cabin stove. The desert was still cool, the sky painted in gentle shades of orange and pink. He would step outside and breathe in the dry air, feeling it fill his lungs and settle in his chest. The world was quiet at that hour, the way it was before people stirred and towns came alive with voices and movement. He liked it this way. The silence of the desert felt honest, unlike the chatter and expectations of the townfolk. His days followed a careful routine. He would tend a small garden, digging and planting seeds in the harsh soil, careful to give each plant just enough water. Then he would check his traps along a narrow path in the desert, hoping for rabbits or small game. Hunting was not just a task, it was a ritual. It connected him to life in a way that words never could. In the evenings, he would sit by his fire and mend tools, sharpen knives, and prepare for the next day. His life was simple, disciplined, and ordered. But underneath it all, there was a restlessness he could not shake. People in the town often tried to understand him. Some pitied him. Others were frustrated. Many women had come to his cabin over the years, offering gifts, kindness, or promises of love. Yet each time he would smile politely and refuse. He had never raised his voice or shown anger, but his refusals were firm. "I am not ready," he would say, or "I cannot offer what you seek." At first, people assumed he was shy or proud, but as years passed, whispers turned into rumors. Some said he had been hurt long ago, perhaps by a love lost or a betrayal too deep to forget. Others suggested he simply preferred solitude, that he had chosen the desert over people, and that was all there was to it. Despite his refusals, he did not live without care. He would help those in need quietly. If someone was sick or lost in the desert, he would be the one who appeared without question, guiding them to safety or tending to their wounds. His generosity was quiet, without expectation, and that made people respect him even more. They may not have understood his heart, but they knew he had a strong moral compass, a sense of justice and honor that could not be swayed. Yet even in his kindness, there was a loneliness that clung to him. In the stillness of the night, he would sometimes sit by his window, looking at the vast expanse of desert stretching toward the horizon. The stars were brilliant there, burning brightly in the black sky, and he would think about the emptiness inside him. It was not loneliness born from a lack of people. He had people enough, neighbors and travelers and strangers who crossed his path. It was something deeper, a feeling that life was passing by in its simplest moments, and he was missing some vital piece of it. Over time, the town had tried many ways to draw him out of his solitude. Neighbors invited him to festivals, feasts, and gatherings, and women, some kind and patient, others bold and determined, tried to get his attention. They would bring flowers, cooked meals, or hand-sewn garments, hoping to capture his heart. But every attempt ended the same way, with the man stepping back, shaking his head, and walking away. He was polite, careful not to hurt feelings, yet firm enough to make it clear he was untouchable in matters of love. Even so, he was not blind to the beauty around him. The desert, though harsh and unforgiving, had a strange grace. He loved the way the sun set behind the distant mesas, painting the rocks in fiery reds and golds. He marveled at the quiet of the desert nights, when coyotes howled in the distance and the moon rose like a silent guardian over the sands. In the desert he found a connection to life itself, a rhythm that was patient and true. It gave him comfort, but it also reminded him of the emptiness he could not escape. One evening, after a long day of work, he returned to his cabin to find a letter tucked under the door. Letters were rare, as few dared approach him, but this one was different. The handwriting was careful, flowing, almost musical. He unfolded it slowly and read the words. It was from a woman in town, one he had met only briefly, who asked not for love, but for understanding. She wrote about life in the town, about struggles and joys, about the quiet longing she saw in him even from a distance. He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on his table. A small part of him felt a flicker of curiosity, but it was fleeting. He knew he could not answer it, not because he did not care, but because he did not know who he was inside. Years of solitude had taught him self-reliance, and that self-reliance had become armor. Opening himself to someone meant facing a truth he was not ready to face, that he needed more than survival, more than routine, more than quiet. Days passed, and life continued in its familiar pattern. He went out into the desert, checked traps, tended his garden, and repaired his cabin. The letter remained untouched, a symbol of a world that was close, but just out of reach. He thought about it sometimes, wondering if he was missing something crucial, but quickly pushed the thought away. The desert, he decided, was honest and clear. People were complicated and often hurtful. Better to live simply, as he had always done, than risk heartbreak or disappointment. Even in his isolation, he noticed the changes in seasons. The desert could be brutal in summer, with sun that burned like fire, and icy in winter when wind whipped across the sands. He adapted to it all, finding routines that allowed him to survive and even thrive. He collected rainwater, preserved food for the winter, and kept a careful watch over the small herd of goats he raised. He lived with patience, with diligence, and with a quiet dignity that was almost invisible to others, but unmistakable to those who observed closely. Sometimes, when he returned from a long walk in the desert, he would sit outside and watch the horizon. He imagined a life that was not for him, a life of companionship and shared joy. But each time, the vision would fade. He would tell himself that he was not meant for that he had responsibilities, that he could not risk distraction or weakness. It was a self-imposed exile, yet he did not know how to break it. As the sun sank behind the distant cliffs, he would light a small lantern in his cabin and prepare a simple meal. He ate quietly, listening to the wind and the distant sounds of the desert. The stars began to emerge, tiny diamonds scattered across the sky, and he felt a strange mix of awe and melancholy. Life went on around him, vibrant and untamed, yet he remained apart, a man who refused to be known fully by anyone. And so, life continued in its rhythm, steady and unchanging. The man remained a figure of mystery in the town, a man who refused every woman yet lived a life full of silent courage and quiet compassion. Deep inside, though, something was stirring, a question he had never allowed himself to ask, a longing that no routine or solitude could satisfy. Little did he know, his life was about to change in a way that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the true meaning of salvation. Life in the town carried on around the man, full of sound, laughter, and the small dramas that mark everyday life. Women continued to talk about him quietly, some with curiosity, some with admiration. and some with frustration. They could not understand why a man so strong, so capable, and so kind would refuse companionship. There were those who believed he had a reason hidden deep inside, a secret wound that kept him from opening his heart. Others thought he simply enjoyed solitude too much. Whatever the truth, the man continued his daily routine, untouched by gossip, unaffected by expectations, and yet always aware of the attention he drew without ever seeking it. One morning, a young woman from town came to his cabin. She was gentle, with eyes that shone with curiosity and hope. She carried a small basket of fresh bread she had baked herself, hoping to share it with him as an act of kindness. When he opened the door, she smiled warmly. "I thought you might like some bread," she said softly. Her voice was kind, honest, without any hint of demand or expectation. The man looked at her, taking in the simplicity of her gesture. For a moment, he considered accepting, then politely shook his head. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but I cannot accept gifts in that way." The young woman hesitated, then smiled bravely. "I just wanted to do something nice," she said, and turned to leave. The man watched her go, feeling a small pang in his chest, though he did not understand why. Another woman arrived a few days later, this one older and more determined. She had heard stories of his strength and independence and was drawn to the idea of helping him in his quiet life. She offered to tend his garden, to care for his home, even to share stories from the town that might bring warmth to his solitude. Once again, he listened politely, thanked her for her kindness, and refused. "I appreciate your offer," he said, "but my life is set this way. I cannot change it for anyone." She frowned but nodded, realizing that he was unmovable. She left, disappointed but respectful, knowing that he was not cruel but protected by a wall no one had yet breached. These visits became a pattern. Women came with small gifts, cooked meals, or invitations to social events. He listened, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with quiet amusement, but always refused. Inside, he wrestled with thoughts he rarely allowed himself to consider. He wondered if he was too set in his ways, too stubborn, or too afraid. He feared that opening his heart could bring pain, that vulnerability might destroy the careful life he had built in the desert. Yet at the same time, a small part of him longed for connection, for companionship that could fill the emptiness he sometimes felt in the quiet hours of night. Even the townspeople who admired him most could not understand this tension. They saw a man capable of generosity and courage, someone who would ride into danger to help another, or share his knowledge of the land without hesitation. They saw a man with skill, with patience, with steady hands and unwavering eyes. And yet, he remained alone. Some whispered that he must have been hurt deeply in the past, perhaps by a woman he loved and lost, or by some tragedy that left him wary of trust. Others thought that he simply preferred solitude, that the desert had claimed his heart before anyone else could. One afternoon, he met a woman while walking through the desert. She had wandered from the town, curious about the man who lived alone and had gotten lost among the rocks and sand. She looked frightened when he found her, the sun beating down on her back, sweat staining her dress. The man approached calmly, his voice steady. "Are you lost?" he asked. She nodded, tears in her eyes. Without hesitation, he guided her back to his cabin, offering water and shade along the way. She tried to express gratitude, offering a smile, a touch, even words of admiration. He accepted her thanks but gently refused any further closeness. "I am not the man you think I am," he said. "I help because it is right, not for reward or friendship." She looked at him, confused, yet somehow respectful of the boundaries he set. Despite these encounters, the man remained alert to the world around him. He noticed changes in the desert, the bloom of small wildflowers after rare rains, the tracks of animals weaving through the sand, and the distant shadows of clouds moving across the mesas. These details brought him quiet joy, a reminder that life continued in its rhythm, and that even in solitude, he was connected to something larger. The desert was honest, clear, and enduring, unlike the complexities of human relationships, which he found often overwhelming and unpredictable. Occasionally, he would hear gossip from passing travelers or from the town. Stories of women who tried to charm him, of young ladies disappointed by his refusals, of neighbors speculating about his past. He listened without judgment, though sometimes a small smile touched his lips. The world could say what it liked. He was not concerned with approval or criticism. Yet deep down there was a growing awareness that perhaps something or someone might come along who could change everything he believed about life and love. Then, one day, someone new appeared, someone unlike any woman who had come before. She was an Apache woman, strong and confident, her eyes holding a quiet fire that immediately caught his attention. She did not approach with gifts or words of flattery. She did not try to charm or persuade. Instead, she looked at him directly with a calm, unshakable gaze. Her presence alone seemed to stir something inside him he had not felt in years, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and intrigue. Their first conversation was brief but powerful. She asked him questions that no one else had dared, questions not about routine or survival, but about life itself. "Are you looking for a wife or salvation?" she asked simply, her voice steady and clear. The words struck him with their weight and meaning. He had never been asked such a question. Women before had sought his heart, his hands, or his companionship, but no one had ever spoken to the emptiness he sometimes felt, the quiet longing he rarely acknowledged. Her question was not about marriage, but about life, about purpose, about what it truly meant to be fulfilled. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, trying to read her intentions, her strength, her understanding of the world. There was no trick in her gaze, no manipulation or demand. There was only honesty, clarity, and a sense of deep knowing. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, not by force or cruelty, but by the simple, undeniable truth in her words. It was uncomfortable, yet strangely liberating. In the days that followed, the Apache woman returned several times. She observed his routines, shared stories of the desert from her own perspective, and spoke of life in ways that made him think differently about his own existence. She did not push or demand, but she did not retreat either. Her presence was steady, like a river that flows without hurry, reshaping the land quietly but profoundly over time. The man began to notice how his own heart and mind were responding. He felt something unfamiliar. Anticipation, a desire to listen more deeply, to understand what she could teach him, and perhaps to discover parts of himself he had long ignored. Their conversations were not easy. At times he resisted, defending his routines, his solitude, his way of life. He feared that opening himself to her might unravel the careful life he had built. Yet, he could not deny the small changes he noticed, moments of laughter he had not experienced in years, thoughts of kindness toward others that felt deeper than mere duty, and a sense of hope he had long thought lost. The town began to notice the shift as well. Some whispered about the Apache woman and the man, speculating on what might develop between them. Others observed quietly, recognizing that there was something different in the man's demeanor, a lightness, a curiosity, a willingness to consider what he had once rejected. He, however, remained cautious. He had been hurt too many times by expectations and disappointment to move too quickly. Yet deep inside, he knew that the arrival of this woman might be the moment he had been waiting for, the challenge he could not ignore, and the opportunity to confront the emptiness he had carried for so long. As the sun set on the desert each evening, he would sit outside and reflect on the encounters of the day. He realized that the visits from women in the past had been kind, sincere, and thoughtful, but none had asked him the questions he truly needed to answer. None had challenged him to consider the life he was leading, the emptiness he carried, or the possibility of change. The Apache woman had done that in a single question, and that question lingered in his mind, growing louder with each passing day. He did not yet understand what lay ahead. He could feel that his life was about to shift in ways he could not predict. The routine he had clung to for so long, the solitude he had protected so carefully, and the independence he had valued above all else, were all being challenged, not by force or fear, but by wisdom, courage, and honesty. For the first time, he realized that refusing every woman had not been about pride, stubbornness, or fear of failure. It had been about waiting for someone who could reach the deeper part of him, someone who could ask the questions he could not ask himself. And so, the desert remained quiet around him, still and eternal, while inside something had begun to stir. A question had been asked, a challenge had been made, and a man who had lived alone for many years began, slowly, to imagine a life that was not just about survival, work, and solitude, but about understanding, growth, and perhaps, one day, a connection that could transform him entirely. The desert heat was soft in the early morning, the wind carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. The man woke as usual, lighting a small fire and tending to his cabin before stepping outside to greet the day. But this morning felt different. There was a tension he could not name, a quiet anticipation in the air, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. He walked toward the edge of his property, eyes scanning the horizon, when he saw her. The Apache woman had arrived again, moving steadily toward him, her presence commanding yet calm. She carried no gifts, no words of flattery, only herself. That alone was enough to unsettle him in a way he had not expected. She stopped a short distance away, and he noticed the strength in her posture, the ease with which she moved through the desert terrain. She looked at him directly, her dark eyes steady and unflinching, as if she could see not only the man before her, but the man he had been for many years, and perhaps even the man he could become. For a moment he felt a flicker of vulnerability, a strange and unfamiliar emotion. He had long prided himself on his independence, his ability to live alone without need or desire for companionship. Yet here was a woman who seemed immune to charm or persuasion, and who challenged him in ways no one else ever had. "You do not speak much," she said finally, her voice calm and deliberate. "But I can hear your thoughts in the silence." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made him pause. He opened his mouth to reply, but found no words adequate to express what he felt. He had lived many years avoiding such confrontations, careful to maintain control over his life and his feelings. But with her, control seemed unnecessary, almost impossible. He felt exposed, not threatened, but seen, in a way that both terrified and intrigued him. She stepped closer, careful not to intrude, but with confidence that left no room for doubt. "The desert teaches many lessons," she said. "It teaches survival, patience, and endurance. But it also teaches something more, something that few understand. It teaches the value of life and the meaning of connection." He listened silently, captivated by her words. She spoke not with judgment, but with clarity and insight, challenging him to consider the emptiness he carried and the life he had chosen for himself. Over the next days, she returned repeatedly. Sometimes they would sit together in silence, watching the sun rise over the mesas. Other times she would speak of the desert, of the animals, the land and the skies, sharing knowledge that seemed ancient and wise. She did not demand attention or affection, but her presence alone began to change the rhythm of his days. He found himself listening more, observing more, and even questioning habits he had long thought unchangeable. One afternoon, she invited him to accompany her on a walk through the rocky hills nearby. At first, he hesitated, concerned about leaving his routine, about stepping into a situation he could not fully control. But something in her gaze persuaded him. He followed, each step, stirring feelings he had long buried. As they walked, she spoke of life in a way that was both simple and profound, telling stories of her people, their traditions, and the wisdom passed down through generations. He listened with growing admiration, struck by the depth of her understanding and the patience in her voice. "You have lived alone for many years," she said as they paused near a dry creek bed. "You have survived, yes, but you have also avoided life itself. There is more to living than enduring. There is learning, growing, and understanding." Her words were gentle but firm, leaving no room for denial. He felt a stirring in his chest, a mixture of curiosity and fear. For the first time, he considered that perhaps he had been avoiding something far greater than loneliness or companionship. Perhaps he had been avoiding himself. She did not push him to answer her questions. Instead, she allowed space for reflection, trusting that he would confront his own truths in his own time. He found himself thinking about the past, about choices he had made, and about the reasons he had built walls around his heart. He realized that solitude had been both a refuge and a prison. He had valued independence, yes, but he had also avoided the challenges and growth that connection might bring. Her presence forced him to see the life he had shaped not as freedom, but as limitation. During these days, small acts of shared work brought them closer. They repaired fences, collected firewood, and tended to the small garden he had cultivated for years. In these tasks, he noticed the way she moved with purpose, efficiency, and care. She respected the land as he did, but also approached it with an awareness he had never seen. Through shared labor, they began to communicate in subtle ways, through glances, gestures, and shared understanding. Words were not always necessary. Trust was built in quiet, deliberate moments of cooperation. One evening, after a long day, they sat together outside the cabin, watching the sky darken and stars emerge. The desert was alive with sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the brush, and the whisper of wind through the sage. He found himself speaking more than usual, telling her about his routines, his observations, and even his fears. She listened with patience, never interrupting, never judging. It was as if her presence allowed him to confront emotions he had long buried, to consider thoughts he had avoided for years. "Why do you fear connection?" she asked quietly. "Is it because of loss, or because you do not trust yourself?" Her question was simple, yet it struck him deeply. He had never considered that his refusal of companionship might be more about fear than choice. He realized that he had avoided the vulnerability of human connection not out of pride, but out of a need to protect himself from pain. Her words illuminated a truth he had hidden even from himself. He had built walls not just to live alone, but to survive emotionally, to avoid confronting his own longing and emptiness. As days turned into weeks, the bond between them deepened. He began to look forward to her visits, to the sound of her voice, and to the quiet moments they shared in the desert. He noticed changes in himself, patience, awareness, and a willingness to consider ideas he had long dismissed. His solitude, once a shield, began to feel less necessary. He began to understand that true strength was not only in independence, but in the courage to face life with openness and honesty. The Apache woman, for her part, never forced him into decisions or declarations. She allowed him to discover his own path, to reflect, and to grow. She respected his boundaries while challenging him gently, encouraging him to confront the emptiness he had carried for so long. In her presence, he discovered that connection could be more than companionship. It could be understanding, growth, and even salvation of the spirit. One day, as they walked along a ridge overlooking the valley, she spoke of choices and life's meaning. "You have been waiting for something, though you did not know what it was," she said. "You have waited for a question that matters more than any answer. You have waited for someone to challenge you, not to change you, but to help you see yourself clearly. That is why I asked, are you looking for a wife or salvation?" Her words echoed in his mind, stirring emotions and thoughts he could not yet name. He realized that she had seen through him in a way no one else had. For the first time in his life, he considered that perhaps love was not just about companionship or desire, but about understanding, trust, and the courage to face oneself. Perhaps salvation was not a distant goal, but a process that began with honesty, connection, and the willingness to embrace life fully. Her question, once so simple, now carried weight and clarity, guiding him towards self-reflection and growth. As the sun set behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in gold and crimson, the man understood that his life had shifted. He no longer viewed solitude as strength alone, but as a starting point for understanding. He no longer refused companionship blindly, but with awareness. And he realized that the Apache woman, in her quiet, steady way, had begun to open doors he did not know existed. Doors to understanding, trust, and perhaps, one day, to love. That evening, he lit his fire as usual and sat outside, feeling the desert around him, as he had always done. But now, he felt a quiet warmth within himself, a spark of curiosity and hope. He knew the journey was only beginning. The woman had not asked for his heart, had not demanded commitment, yet she had challenged him in ways no one else ever had. He understood that the question she asked was not merely about marriage, but about life, purpose, and the courage to live fully. And in that understanding, he felt a stirring of change, the first true movement in a heart that had long been silent. The desert remained quiet, eternal and still, yet within it, a man began to awaken, learning that life, like the land around him, could be harsh and beautiful, challenging and rewarding, lonely and filled with unexpected connection. And with the Apache woman's presence, he began to see that the solitude he had cherished could become something richer, a preparation for growth, understanding, and perhaps, in time, salvation of the heart and soul. The days in the desert grew longer, and the man found his routine slowly shifting. The presence of the Apache woman had become a quiet rhythm in his life, like the wind brushing across the sand or the distant cries of coyotes at night. Her visits were no longer interruptions, but moments he anticipated with curiosity he had not felt in years. Each day she taught him not with force, but with observation and stories, showing him ways to see the world differently, to feel life more fully, and to question the boundaries he had long set for himself. They spent hours walking through the desert, examining tracks of animals, studying plants, and watching the sun rise and set over the mesas. She spoke of the land with a reverence he had never noticed before, explaining the delicate balance of life, the need for patience, and the importance of understanding one's place in the world. Her words were gentle, yet they cut through the walls he had built. He began to realize that survival alone was not enough, that life could be richer, more meaningful if approached with awareness and heart. One afternoon, she asked him to help her gather herbs and roots that grew in the hills beyond his cabin. At first, he hesitated, worried about leaving his small herd and garden, but he decided to go, trusting her guidance. As they moved through the rocky terrain, she pointed out plants with healing properties, explained their uses, and told stories of his ancestors, of their struggles and wisdom. He listened carefully, absorbing more than just the knowledge of the land. He absorbed her patience, her way of seeing connections between things he had long ignored, and her understanding of life's subtler truths. "Life is not just about surviving," she said one day as they rested in the shade of a large rock. "It is about noticing, understanding, and caring." "You have survived well, but have you lived fully?" The question lingered in his mind long after the words had passed. He realized he had been alive in body, but often not in spirit. The routines that had once given him comfort now seemed rigid, almost protective of a hollow space he had not acknowledged. He felt a quiet tension within him, the first stirrings of change he could not control. Their lessons were not easy. She challenged him gently but firmly, asking questions about fear, loss, and loneliness. Sometimes he resisted, retreating into the familiar comfort of silence and routine. Other times he felt frustration, wondering why she pressed him to confront feelings he had long ignored. Yet each time he found that her challenges were not meant to shame or force, but to encourage understanding, reflection, and growth. With each encounter, he began to see the limitations of his past choices, the ways his solitude had protected him from pain, but also from connection, joy, and even hope. One evening, after a long day of gathering herbs and tending the small garden together, he sat with her outside the cabin. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the sky glowed with shades of orange and purple. She handed him a small bundle of dried herbs, explaining their uses for healing and comfort. He took it silently, noticing the care in her hands, the steadiness in her gaze, and the patience in her voice. In that moment, he felt something stir deep within him, a recognition that life, like the desert, could be harsh, demanding, and unforgiving, but also filled with beauty, connection, and learning. She spoke then of choice, of the paths we take, and of the courage required to follow them. "You can continue as you have," she said, "living alone, surviving, avoiding the challenges that make life messy and painful. Or you can choose to live fully, to trust, to grow, and to face what you have avoided for so long." Her words were simple, yet profound. He felt the weight of them pressing gently on his heart, urging him to consider possibilities he had never dared imagine. In the following days, he found himself reflecting on their lessons more deeply. He thought about his life, the years of careful solitude, and the walls he had built around his heart. He began to recognize the ways fear had guided his choices, how he had avoided vulnerability to protect himself from loss. He realized that these walls had also prevented him from experiencing true understanding, connection, and joy. Each moment with the Apache woman was a mirror, showing him parts of himself he had long hidden, and inviting him to confront them with courage. She continued to teach him through action as well as words. They worked together on small projects around his cabin, repaired fences, collected water from distant springs, and tended the land with care. Through these shared tasks, he began to understand trust and cooperation in ways he had never known. He realized that allowing another into his life did not diminish his independence, but enriched it. He began to see that connection and strength could coexist, and that vulnerability was not weakness, but a form of courage. One day they were walking along the ridge above the valley. When she asked him to speak of his fears, he hesitated, unsure how to voice feelings he had long denied. Yet with her steady gaze and patient presence, he found words emerging from deep within. He spoke of the emptiness he sometimes felt, of the weight of years spent alone, and of the fear that he might never fully live or understand himself. She listened without judgment, nodding gently, and in her silence, he found reassurance. "You are not weak," she said finally. "You have carried much, and you have survived. But survival alone is not life. You have the courage to face yourself, to grow, and to embrace what life offers. That is the true strength of a man." Her words resonated deeply. For the first time, he felt not only seen, but understood. It was as if a new light had entered the spaces he had long kept dark, illuminating paths he had never dared to walk. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened. They shared meals, stories, and quiet moments of observation in the desert. He began to notice the small joys he had overlooked, the way sunlight glimmered on the sand, the delicate pattern of an animal track, the quiet whisper of wind through the rocks. He realized that these moments, once mundane, now held meaning, because he was experiencing them with awareness, with presence, and with someone who had opened his heart to possibility. Yet the transformation was not without struggle. Old habits and fears often returned, threatening to pull him back into the comfort of routine and solitude. He would sometimes retreat, questioning his readiness for change, doubting his ability to face the emotional challenges the Apache woman had awakened in him. But each time she was there, not to force him forward, but to guide him gently, reminding him that growth required patience, reflection, and courage. Slowly, he began to trust himself, and to trust the lessons she offered. One night, as the desert cooled under a blanket of stars, he sat beside the Apache woman by the fire. They were quiet for a long while, listening to the sounds of the desert, until she spoke softly. "You are learning, but the journey is not complete. There will be moments of doubt, moments when fear tempts you to retreat. But remember, courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward in spite of it." He nodded, understanding the depth of her words. He realized that the true challenge was not survival, but embracing life fully, with all its uncertainties, risks, and possibilities. In the following days, he began to take small steps toward openness. He shared stories from his past, talked about his routines, and admitted fears he had long denied. He found that speaking them aloud, in the presence of someone who listened without judgment, was liberating. The walls he had built for decades began to crumble, not all at once, but piece by piece, revealing a man capable of growth, trust, and understanding. He also began to see the Apache woman differently. She was no longer simply a teacher or a visitor. She was a companion in the truest sense, someone who challenged him, supported him, and reflected back the parts of himself he had long ignored. Their connection was not built on words alone, but on shared experiences, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that life, even in its harshest moments, could be beautiful when approached with awareness and courage. By the end of this period, the man felt a profound shift within himself. He no longer viewed solitude as a shield, but as a preparation for deeper understanding. He no longer refused companionship out of fear, but with awareness. He realized that life was not just about surviving, but about learning, connecting, and growing. And through the steady presence of the Apache woman, he began to understand what it truly meant to live fully, with courage, openness, and the willingness to embrace both the joys and challenges that life offers. The desert dawn was cool and still, the sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold. The man stepped outside his cabin feeling the weight of years and the quiet anticipation of change. For many mornings he had risen to the same routine, tending his garden, checking his traps, and moving through the desert in silent reflection. But today there was something different, a subtle shift inside him that he could not ignore. He had learned much over the weeks since the Apache woman arrived. He had learned patience, awareness, courage, and trust. He had learned that life was more than survival, more than routine, more than solitude. She was waiting for him near the edge of the small garden, her eyes calm and steady, reflecting the light of the rising sun. She did not speak immediately, simply observing him with the quiet confidence that had drawn him to her in the first place. He felt a warmth in his chest he had not known in years, a sense of possibility, of connection, and of understanding. For the first time, he considered the full meaning of her question, "Are you looking for a wife or salvation?" He realized that he had been searching all along, though not consciously, not for companionship alone, but for the deeper sense of life that had eluded him for so long. He approached her slowly, unsure what to say, yet feeling compelled to act. She looked at him, patient and steady, as if she already knew what he would choose. The desert was quiet around them, the world holding its breath for the moment that would change everything. He felt his old fears rise, the walls he had built for so many years whispering for him to retreat, to return to the familiar rhythm of solitude. But he also felt the strength that had grown in him, the courage to face himself, to embrace change, and to trust not only the world, but another human being. "You have taught me much," he said finally, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You have shown me what I did not know I was missing. I thought I understood life, but I see now that I only survived it. You have helped me see what it means to live fully." She smiled, not with pride or judgment, but with quiet acknowledgement. Her presence had always been a mirror reflecting what he needed to see, and now he could finally see it clearly. A life lived in isolation was not enough, and true fulfillment required openness, courage, and connection. They spent the day together, walking through the desert as they had so often before. But now, each step was different. He noticed the colors of the rocks, the patterns in the sand, the movement of the clouds, and the gentle rustle of the desert breeze. He saw life in every detail, a vivid richness that had always been there but had gone unnoticed. She pointed out tracks of animals, plants hidden in the shadows, and the signs of water beneath the earth. He absorbed these lessons, not just as knowledge, but as understanding of the interconnectedness of life. In the evening, they returned to the cabin, where he prepared a simple meal for them both. The fire crackled in the small hearth, casting warmth and light across the room. They sat together, sharing food and stories, speaking quietly about the days that had passed and the journey that had brought them to this moment. He realized that this was not simply companionship, not merely a partnership, but a deeper bond, built on trust, shared experiences, and the courage to face life fully. As the night deepened, the Apache woman spoke softly. "You have grown," she said. "You have faced fear, embraced change, and allowed yourself to see clearly. You have learned that strength is not in solitude alone, but in courage, trust, and understanding. You have found what you were looking for, not only in the world around you, but within yourself." He listened, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and understanding. Her words were not a praise or flattery, but an acknowledgement of his journey, the growth he had achieved, and the life he could now embrace. He thought of the years he had spent alone, of the routines that had protected him, and of the walls he had built to guard against pain and vulnerability. He realized that those years had been necessary in their own way, preparing him for this moment, for this understanding, and for the possibility of true connection. Yet now, the walls were no longer needed. He felt a freedom he had never known, a liberation that came not from solitude, but from understanding, trust, and acceptance. In the following days, he and the Apache woman worked together to improve the cabin and surrounding land. They repaired fences, cleared paths, and cultivated the small garden, sharing laughter, effort, and conversation. Each day he noticed the small joys he had overlooked for so long: the warmth of the sun on his skin, the sound of wind through the rocks, the sparkle of stars at night. He felt connected not only to her, but to the desert itself, to the life he had once survived, and to the possibilities that lay ahead. The townspeople began to notice the change as well. They saw a man who had once refused every offer of companionship now moving with purpose, speaking with thoughtfulness, and embracing life in ways they had not seen before. They whispered among themselves, some in admiration, others in quiet surprise. But the man no longer concerned himself with their opinions. He had found understanding, connection, and courage through his own journey, guided by the wisdom and presence of the Apache woman. One evening, as the desert sky turned deep indigo and stars shimmered above, the man and the Apache woman stood together on a ridge overlooking the valley. He felt a sense of completeness he had never experienced, a quiet peace that came from embracing life fully, with trust, courage, and openness. He realized that the question she had asked so long ago, "Are you looking for a wife or salvation?" was not a challenge to his heart alone, but to his soul. He had found both: companionship rooted in understanding and the salvation of a life lived fully and honestly. He spoke then, his voice calm but full of meaning. "I have spent many years alone, believing that solitude was my only path. I now see that life is more than survival. It is growth, understanding, and connection. You have shown me that, not by asking me to change, but by guiding me to see myself clearly." She nodded, understanding the depth of his words. Their bond was no longer a question, no longer a test, but a shared understanding of life, trust, and mutual growth. The following weeks were filled with simple joys and continued lessons. They walked the desert together, tended the land, and shared stories of the past, present, and future. Each moment reinforced the understanding that life was not merely about existing, but about learning, growing, and embracing connection. He found joy in the mundane, peace in the quiet, and fulfillment in the bond they shared. It was a life he had never imagined for himself, yet it was exactly what he had been seeking all along. In time, he understood that the Apache woman had given him more than guidance and companionship. She had opened his heart, challenged his fears, and shown him the meaning of living fully. He no longer feared connection or vulnerability, nor did he cling to solitude as a shield. Instead, he embraced life with courage, trust, and a willingness to grow, knowing that he could face challenges, joys, and sorrows with a heart open to understanding and love. The man who once refused every woman had been transformed, not by force, not by expectation, but by patience, wisdom, and the presence of someone who asked the questions he had never dared to ask himself. The desert remained eternal and still, a witness to the journey he had undertaken, the lessons he had learned, and the life he had chosen to embrace fully. And so, as the sun rose over the mesas one morning, casting long shadows across the desert floor, the man and the Apache woman walked side by side, not just as companions, but as equals in understanding, trust, and shared growth. The man had found what he had long sought, not simply a wife, not merely companionship, but a life of meaning, courage, and fulfillment. He had discovered salvation not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing experience shared with another who saw him, challenged him, and helped him become fully himself. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of sage and the quiet music of the world. He smiled, feeling the fullness of life he had long denied himself, grateful for the journey, for the lessons, and for the woman who had shown him the way. In her presence, he had discovered that true strength was not in solitude alone, but in courage, connection, and the willingness to embrace life fully. And in that realization, he found peace, hope, and a heart finally open to all that life could offer.